Good evening, and welcome to the Association for the Study of African American Life and History Social Justice Webinar Series, Workshop Wednesdays. Welcome back for those of you who have joined us in the past. I'd like to give you a few instructions before we get started. We'd love it if you introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us where you're from. If you're affiliated with an ASALH chapter, throw that in there. If you're here from a university, the city, the town you're from, please let us know. Let us know if you're an ASALH member, and we'd love for all of you to join so you can learn more about all the things that ASALH does. We will engage in questions and answers at intervals throughout the presentation. So please use the Q&A button, throw your questions in there, and we will present them to our leader, and we will hear her answers, and we'll have an engaging dialogue during the webinar. I want to let you know that for the next 2 weeks, we're looking forward to you joining us for the continuation of our virtual social justice series, replicating 2 live offerings that were held at the ASALH conference and provided by Dr. Lisa Brock. All offerings are posted on asalh.org under the Social Justice at ASALH section. And once these 2 new webinars are completed, they'll be added to our diary. Social Justice at ASALH is an interdisciplinary initiative that includes workshops, outreach materials, and fellowships focused on social justice community engagement. This series is brought to you by Howard University Social Justice Consortium, made possible by the Mellon Just Futures Initiative. And so to get us started, I'd like to introduce you to the president of ASALH, Dr. Marvin Delaney.
Good evening. I am Marvin Delaney, president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. ASALH is an acronym that we use for our organization. ASALH has long addressed issues of social justice since the time of its founding in 1915 by historian Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black history. ASALH has operated from the premise that racial discrimination must be fought, not only by legal suits in the courtroom and marches in the street, but also by historical knowledge presented inside and outside of the classroom. Social Justice at ASALH provides free workshops and events, creating a unique opportunity to advance the ASALH and Howard University Social Justice Consortium's goal of broad public audience participation in social justice. Today's program is presented by Dr. Lisa Brock, founder of the Arcus Center for Social Justice Leadership. Dr. Brock is a lifelong activist, retired professor emeritus of transnational Black history, and a graduate of Howard University. Dr. Brock is the curator of the Social Justice at ASALH series, and we are so excited to hear her presentation this evening on Social Justice 103, Understanding the Black Diaspora. I present you Dr. Brock.
Thank you, Marvin, and thank you, Michelle. I'm super excited to be here. Give me a second so I can share what I need to share so everybody can see the presentation. So I hope we're there. Thank you, Marvin, Michelle, and the team at Howard and ASALH for inviting me to participate in this endeavor. It's really exciting. I mean, I was a professor for 36 years before I retired, and this allows me to get my teacher mode on in terms of teaching some of these topics that I love to teach to people. So often I think we end up in the academy of talking to each other. And while we can advance knowledge that way, very often that knowledge does not slip down to the regular people and people from our communities. And so this is an opportunity to do this. And I think ASALH is really wonderful in making this social justice series available to people. So today I'm going to talk about the Black diaspora, understanding the Black diaspora. You might wonder why I'm using the term Black and not African diaspora. And I think it's because I want to push a political point. And the political point is that something happened to us in the Americas. Something happened to us. There was no white or Black before the enslavement of Africans as we know it today. But as white supremacy, the enslavement of African peoples happened, you end up also with the concept of Blackness. You can't have whiteness and enslave Black people without having Blackness. And Blackness is something that unites. It's something that creates a connection with people all over the Americas, even though, as you'll see in my talk today, especially when I'm going to end with some of the complexities and differences in what Blackness is and how it is different in different places, but there still is Blackness. Just like whiteness is different in different places, but it's still whiteness is there. The last 400, 500, 600 years have concretized that process. And we see it every day with the murders of George Floyd, Sandra Bland, and others in this country. And the same thing has happened in other countries as well. So we're going to talk about this, understanding the Black diaspora. I'm going to break it up into five segments. And you should know for each one of these segments, there's thousands of books that you could read. So to try to do African and Black history and all of that in a 2-hour period is not very easy. But I'm going to try to hit some of what I think are the major points in this one. And my hope is that you'll take some of these points and some of these books that I share and start your own journey to learn more about the Black diaspora. So we're going to do 5 areas today: Africa before the Atlantic enslavement, racial capitalism and the trade in Black people, enslavement and resistance, the U.S. imperial project, and Blackness in the Americas. So I hope everybody's with me. There's no way you can talk about the Black diaspora without starting with Africa. If you do, you're making a huge mistake, because of course, much of our culture has come from Africa, and in many ways, and it has been adapted and changed. But you know, I remember spending time in Mozambique and seeing people sing and seeing people dance. And while the music may be a little different than our music, the role of music, the role of dance in the culture was so very present. And it makes me think about Black cultures in the Americas, and of course, Black American culture. I mean, what would the US be without Black music, right? So you have to start with Africa. And one of the other reasons you start with Africa is that, you know, so much of Eurocentrism and white supremacy tries to make it look like there was just nothing in Africa, right? There's nothing there now, just trouble. We know what our former president said about African countries, which was very demeaning and horrible. But also the fact that they try to deny that centuries ago, people in Europe knew about Africa, people in Asia knew about Africa, because Africa had a lot of great trading networks. And I have this map up here because I want you to see from the 700s to the 1500s, Africa was literally connected to networks that we've heard of: the Silk Road, the Mediterranean Sea Complex, and also across the Indian Ocean, all the way over to China and Asia. What's so interesting about that, for 700 years, that trans-Saharan trade brought gold across the Sahara, and that gold ended up all over the world. And what's so interesting about that, I don't know if many people know, that one of the first early coins in Britain, and also this coin came over to the early colonial America, was the guinea, and it's spelled Guinea. Guinea actually is the name of 3 countries in Africa today: Guinea, Equatorial Guinea, and Guinea-Bissau. And it comes from the gold mines that were in West Africa at the time. You had various kingdoms, but they all mined gold in the Guinea gold mines. And this was known in Europe, so much so that one of the early coins in Great Britain, one of the first guineas that was minted on Guinea gold, had literally an African sitting on top of an elephant. Now, of course, very few British people knew what Africans lived like and didn't know if they rode elephants and all of that, but they did know enough to be able to know that gold called Guinea was coming from West Africa. And this went on for 700 years. So there was a lot of knowledge back and forth, and gold was just one thing traded. And then we've often heard of the Swahili as the Swahili language, and we know it as a language, but it evolved in the east coast of Africa as, and that area was known as the Swahili coast because Swahili was actually a trading language of that East Coast network along the east coast of Africa. And it was a combination of Arabic and East African languages. And it had a whole complex in the same period, 700s to 1500s, with the Indian complex. One of the other interesting things is the Ming Dynasty, which existed from 1368 to 1644, that you see Zimbabwe on the African map right here. And you see China up here. What's so interesting about that is that during the Ming Dynasty, there was trading back and forth. And so items from East Africa ended up in China during the Ming Dynasty and vice versa. We have found them in the ruins. Archaeologists have found them. So for instance, there is porcelain from the Ming Dynasty has been found in the ruins of Zimbabwe. And then also images of elephants were painted in China. And China did not have elephants at the time, but elephants were actually brought over. I can't imagine not elephants, I'm sorry. I can't imagine not elephants, did I say giraffes? I meant giraffes. I think I said elephants, but I meant giraffes. That giraffes were brought over from the east coast of Africa all the way to China. And I feel sorry for the giraffes making that long journey, but obviously and evidently, some of them did manage to make it across the Indian Ocean into China. So it's important to understand that when the Europeans, especially the Portuguese first and then others, came to Africa, they came to Africa not looking for people, but looking for gold and a route to India, the Indies, which of course is why folks in the West ended up being called Indians. So I just wanted to highlight one of, again, someone you should know from this African era, and that is Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa was a Malian king in the 1300s that mined that Guinea gold. And what's so interesting is that he was Muslim at the time, and he made a Hajj from all the way from West Africa over to Mecca. And as he moved through West Africa, across the Sahara, into Cairo, he made a huge splash. He had camels laden with gold. He had hundreds of people with him. And he was perceived at the time to be the richest man in the world at that time in the 1300s. And this is actually an image from a Catalan atlas from the 1300s. Catalan is a region in Spain. And so this was in a Catalan atlas, and noting the Mansa Musa's Hajj across West Africa. This is from 1312. So I just wanted to put that out there, but I will tell you this. I'm not one to reify kings, because I bet you Mansa didn't mine that gold. There were some people doing that dirty work. And so we always have to be careful yeah, we want to, it's important to know that there were kingdoms in West Africa. But if you want to really operate a kind of class analysis, you have to also accept that there were people exploited in that kingdom, African people. And then you had enslavement, which began in the late 1400s and continued all the way up until the 1880s. And as you see from this map, folks came from all over West Africa. The bulk of folks actually came from the area of West Central Africa or Angola, which would be Angola today. And that is because the Portuguese were involved in the enslavement in the trade in a way that other areas weren't initially. And so you end up with, and that continued to be a major operation of the Portuguese to be involved in the trade. Of course, they colonized Brazil, which is straight across from Angola, but they also traded with other folks, especially the Spanish, and then of course also other parts of the Caribbean and the U.S. It's important, I think, for Americans, U.S. Americans, to understand that the majority of Black people did not come to the United States. The majority of people went to South America and the Caribbean. It's estimated that 20 million people were taken, but that about 11 million survived and made it. So when we think about those, you always hear about treasure hunters, people looking for sunken ships and sunken treasures in the ocean. There's also sunken boats with people as well. And there was also pirates. We hear about pirates fighting over the booty, the gold and the silver from the Americas. They also fought for human bodies. This was the largest human trafficking episode in history because it lasted so long and it took so many people by force. A lot of folks don't, use that terminology, but this was human trafficking and the selling of people. So it's important to keep all of that in mind. And I'm going to stop now for questions. This will be our first session, our first moment to stop. So if our chat folks would let me know some of the questions people are asking, or if they have asking any questions or comments.
Hi, Dr. Brock. Yes, we do have one. I got stuck on my end. It was really weird. All right, here we go. So we have a couple questions in our question and answer. And the one we have, it says, how can we learn more on the people/groups doing the Mansa Musa dirty work, in quotation?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And there aren't many people writing on that right now. But there, in terms of looking, I know that there are people writing on like Dahomey and other places who were involved in the capturing of folks that ultimately ended up in the slave trade. But that's a great question, and I'm going to keep it. Please, I'm going to keep the chat, and maybe I can put an answer for you in the chat, because I don't have one right off the top of my head. I'm just making an assumption, which is a pretty positive one, that if there's gold, somebody's mining it, and if there's a lot of gold, a lot of people are mining it. So we need to do a lot more work on what's called, this period is called Middle Age Africa. And we do, we have information on the volume of gold that was produced and the volumes of iron that were what was produced, but we don't have a lot about the workers who actually did that work. So I appreciate that question. I don't have an exact answer for you, but I'm definitely going to look it up.
I got it. Thank you, Dr. Brock. Our next one says, do you have any reputable sources you can recommend regarding the use of the term Indian versus Native?
Ooh. Well, you can look at Columbus's diary, And there's a lot of information about that. I mean, especially now with more and more indigenous heritage work. So yes, we can put some books in the chat. I would suggest Columbus's Diary is available. And so is the debate between Bartholomew Diaz and I can't remember, there were two folks in Spain debating treatment of the so-called natives and Indians. Of course, the term native is a constructive, it's interesting because it's a term put on people who live there by an outsider. So it's very interesting. They called them natives, they called them savages, they called them Indians. All of these names were names that were put upon them. But many Native Americans or Indians today, just like being Black, struggle with what to kind of, what's the politically right way to call all themselves, because again, those terms did not exist. Indian did not exist before Europeans called them that. So again, I'll put some sources in the chat, not in the chat, but maybe on the website, because there are quite a few people who have been writing on that. There's some primary documents as well that talk about that era.
Dr. Brock, I have two questions that I can kind of combine together in the chat.
Okay.
One is from Walter, what was slavery like in Africa? But then Cheryl Lowitzer asked, is there any info on how or what initiated the slave trade? I have this sense that there was a need for a workforce, but was there a trigger event?
Interesting. Okay, the first one was, what about enslavement in Africa?
Yes.
Okay, and then the second. Okay. Well, what's so interesting about this is, you know, a lot of people, apologists for the Atlantic trade in human beings, likes to argue, well, Africans sold each other. I mean, you know, what were we to do? As if somehow Africans were on the coast saying, hey, we got people for sale. That's not the way it happened. It's a very complex system in terms of the way it happened. I mean, the whole complex process in terms of the way it happened. There was enslavement and forced labor all over the world during that period between the 700s and the 1500s. In Asia, in the Americas, in Europe, but generally it was not what became known as chattel slavery, in that people were often enslaved because of wars, as captives of war. So you have a war, you capture people, those people go back into the society of the winners of that war, and they are kind of used in different ways, and they generally just merge back into the society. Very seldom were children of slaves. So those children, you weren't born into servitude, you just went into the society. You might be second class, depending on the society. You might rise up and become someone important. One of the things about Middle Eastern slavery that was so interesting is that they brought folks from Africa, but also from Europe. And a similar thing happened. You know, they would capture them from wars, and they would come back. They would mix with the folks there, and their children then would become members of that society. And I'll never forget during the first Desert Storm War the U.S. did against Iraq, that the actual ambassador to the United Nations from Iraq had a fro. He had a fro. He was Black. He had a fro. And actually, when you look at many other Asian countries, they do have Black people there. So, and some of them rose to prominence because you weren't born into slavery and you weren't put into commercial enterprises in the way that capitalism unleashed during the slave trade. So that's the first question. The second is, let's start at that point. I'm going to give you an example of Angola. Angola is right here. Angola was the Congo Kingdom, and it was a very sophisticated kingdom. It had about 8 provinces. It had governors. It had a king. They produced a variety of products. They had a central system. They had a capital called Monte Congo. And the goods from the regions would come into the capital. And then when they were at the capital, they would then be weighed and valued and redistributed throughout the kingdom, in that if you produce one thing and another part of the kingdom produced another thing, you had access to goods from other areas that you didn't actually produce that thing in your area. I hope that's clear. So you basically had different products coming from different areas that were traded throughout the kingdom. So people had access to goods that they did not produce. So that's one thing. So they had a pretty sophisticated system. The Portuguese were the first European power to, the Portuguese being right here, the first European power to come to Africa. And when they came, they initially were trying to find that Guinea gold. They were trying to find goods from the Indies, which was from India over here. And they were trying to find lost Christians. Those were the 3 primary reasons they were going. And this part of Africa was controlled by the Moors. And they couldn't defeat them on land. So, and they knew that the Moors were bringing all those great goods into Southern Europe from Africa, from the East, from Asia, and they had been isolated in some ways. So they wanted to get control. When they pushed the Moors out in the late 1300s, the Portuguese did it first, then the Spanish, and then they came and were bumping along the coast of Africa, and they found the sources of Guinea gold and began trading, and they ended up in the Congo. Now, the reason I use the Congo as an example is because of the way it happened there. So they had a king and who had sons, and literally they had about 100 years, or maybe not 100, about 100 years of good trade between Portugal and the Congo. They sent people, the Congo sent some of the royal family to Europe to study. And the folks in Portugal sent folks to study in West Africa. It's funny that in the Congo, it's funny, the Europeans, of course, sent priests. And, Africans being polytheistic in the sense that they just thought that was an interesting religion. They didn't see it as a threat necessarily. And so they let them build a church and come and hang out. And they just thought it was the religion of the albinos, which is what they initially thought they were. And so they had been trading and getting to know each other for about 100 years. And then the Portuguese, during that 100 years, the Portuguese were experimenting with they had been to India, and they had gotten the sugarcane seeds. India was the first to produce sugarcane. So they had gotten all the way over to India, and they got those seeds, and they started experimenting with producing sugar in these on these islands off of the west coast of Africa. And they were successful, and in some of the islands in Mediterranean, and they were successful. They were able to grow the sugarcane, and then they can trade sugar. So they began trading sugar back to the Congo, right? And I hate to say, sugar was the oil of this period. I mean, can you imagine life without sugar? People would die and kill for sugar, just like they die and kill for oil today. And so the king was trading trading sugar with the Portuguese. And then the Portuguese came to him and said, we got these islands. We got this one called Sao Tome. And Sao Tome was kind of up in here, and St. Helena. We got these islands out here, and we just need a few people to help us produce sugarcane. So they asked the king, did he have any captives he could share? He said, yes, he shared some captives. They also brought some indentured servants from Portugal, and they began producing sugarcane. They then, of course, began to go over to the east coast of South America, because by this time, by 1492, of course, Columbus was all the way up here. And so in the early 1500s, They come straight across and they discover, in their terms, discover a huge landmass over there. And they decide they want to produce sugar there. They go back to the king of the Congo. I know this is a long story, but it's important. They go back to the king of the Congo and they say, we need some more people. And the king of Congo says, I ain't got no more people. And so they say, well, we want some more people. And he said, we don't have any more people to give you. So what do? They're dastardly. So they find a governor around Luanda and they offer him guns and sugar. And he was an opportunist. You know, you had your opportunists, like some of the ones in the recent election who can be bought and sold. And they separated from the kingdom and began snatching people from inside and selling to the Portuguese for sugar and for guns, and therefore gaining power. Sometime later, the king actually discovers that he has, his kingdom is being destroyed by the slave trade. And so he is forced to think about what to do. So he wrote a letter to the King of Portugal. We're not sure if the letter ever got there, but the letter actually did get translated en route. And it was a letter saying that the Portuguese were literally stealing their people and his free people and causing havoc. And he wanted the King of Portugal to do something. As time went on, he then decides to get involved in the trade because it was the only way that he could stabilize his kingdom. And this is a kind of story that happened all over the west coast of Africa. So I know those are two long answers, but I thought it was worth sharing. Who's the football player in Georgia that just ran? I forget his name. What's his name, Nick?
Herschel Walker.
Yeah, so they had Herschel Walkers back then. They sure did.
Dr. Brock, we're going to continue on with your presentation and save these questions if we have time at the end.
Okay. Okay. I'm moving on to the third topic, which is racial capitalism. This is a term that we should have been using a lot, many years ago, but it's really been theorized since around 1985. And it's a theory whose time has come because we have so much information now that shows us that racism and capitalism arose at the same time. You can't separate them. They rose at the same time. In Europe. So we're talking about the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s is the rise of capitalism. It's so interesting. So many, kids of Western history learn about, the transition from serfdom to capitalism, the end of the horrible system of serfdom, and the rise of political rights and social rights and economic rights of regular people who had been serfs in Europe. And so they're called political revolutions. But this was the evolution of bourgeoisies and evolution of capitalism. It was also the evolution of stock markets and the evolution of the slave trade. And they all happened around the same time. And what people don't realize is that the early stock markets in Belgium, the Netherlands, and England, some of the first companies that were traded were actually slave trading companies. So what that means, and I often think about day traders today, that's a big thing now right, among young people. Do you know what you're trading in? Because if you don't know and you're making money, you might be trading in something that's as dastardly as this was. I'm just putting it out there. But so people were investing, and if you know how stock markets work, basically a company is public, people invest in that company, and then they get dividends back. So at this time, a regular person might put $10 in and get $100 back. And so these early trading companies, they weren't just enslavement companies. You also had trading companies going to the east part of the world, going to Asia. But clearly, slave trading companies were a part of the first evolution public trading stock markets in Europe. And so when you think about that, and then you think about all the money that people made off of enslavement, you cannot disassociate it from capitalism. And so one of the reasons I like this slide, and I wanted to share it with you, is because I think a lot of people don't really realize the volume of enslavement. So by volume, I mean, you know, when you go back to that that slide before, and you see the arrows, you see the areas that people came from, you say, okay, there's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 strands. But when you think about it in capitalist terms, you have to think about the fact that these are companies, evolving companies, trading and competing against each other. So for instance, and they're trading all over the west coast of Africa. So like, for instance, in Africa, you had 192 known African ports that Europeans were engaged in the slave trade. 192 on that coast. That's something, the volume. And then England between 1752 and 1821 had 392 registered slave trading merchants. The Netherlands had 530 private owner voyages, and the US had 91 plus registered slave traders, 400,000 slave owners, and 2,000 plantations in South Carolina alone. So the volume of this was the economic engine of the time. This was making people very, very, very wealthy. And that image that I have at the top of my slide is an image from Liverpool, from their customs house, which is now their city hall. And if you ever get to Liverpool, they have a great museum on the slave trade, because they recognize and understand that Liverpool, the slave trade made Liverpool. It made their shipping industry, it made them rich. And so literally on the fascia of a lot of the buildings are images of Africans in Liverpool, of Africans. So it's very, very interesting. And then you look at the companies in the US. I mean, we've heard about some of these. Aetna, of course, ensured the domestic slave trade. Brooks Brothers from New Orleans made what was called Negro cloth. It was they got their start making clothes for the enslaved. Railway companies, Bank of London. And then the New York Life Insurance Company is so interesting. I've seen some of their mortgages. They mortgaged the domestic trade in people in the US. So for instance, you know, a lot of people think people just went with money and bought them. No, it was too much money. So they took out mortgages to purchase groups of Black people, and New York Life Insurance was the bank that gave them the mortgages. One of the things that's so interesting that they mortgaged were futures of Black women. So when a Black woman was sold, you'd often see Black woman's futures. The Black woman and her futures are part of the deed. I'd like people to think about that, and maybe in the next section they can ask me about it. And then you see all the, on the final list, you see all the universities that were connected in one way or another to enslavement. Craig Wilder's book, Ebony and Ivy, is excellent, looking at the Ivy Leagues and how all of them in one way or another were involved in slavery. So from taking young men from the South and who had to bring their slaves with them to take care of them. And or Georgetown sold 272 men, women, and children in order to make Georgetown a friar, make Georgetown University solvent. It was insolvent. It was in insolvency in 1838. They sold 272 people to save Georgetown. And then I recently went and visited William and Mary And William and Mary actually owned slaves that worked at the university. And they've begun to recognize who those people were because they have names. They know, I mean, lots of times these people, we know the names of folks because often when they're sold, their names are put on list. And so racial capitalism was just this huge thing, and enslavement was its engine. But it wasn't just enslavement in the way you think, like direct. There are all these subsidiary industries that benefited from enslavement. I mean, of course, we did agricultural production, industrial revolutions, manufacturing industries, because a lot of people don't realize too that enslavement was also urban. So New York had slaves, Charleston had slaves, almost every city on the East Coast had slaves working, building those roads, those bridges, digging those canals. And it was very, very difficult work. In Charleston, the fisheries, you know, all that great shrimp and crab that you get down there was actually Black people's work, and still is to a certain extent today. If you ever go to that market, that open air market in Charleston, that's where enslaved women actually sold some of the things that those fishermen brought to market. And shipping industries. I mean, the first shipping industries in Europe came about to be involved in trade. And I have these other 3 slides up here because a lot of people don't realize if you go to DC, the top of the Capitol building, that dome, that person up there with the headgear was actually manufactured and smelted and worked in a factory by a man named Philip Reed, who was an enslaved person of a slaver by the name of Mills. And so actually Philip Reed is the one that designed that. I think Obama is the one that brought that to the fore when he was president. And then I have the White House here because Black men and Black women worked to build the White House. This is a list of people. And between Mr. Hoban, he leased his slaves to the government. And that's the list of people that were leased. And then there's another one that talks about the amount of money that he got. So we often talk about, you know, one of the things we talked about in some of our other things is reparations. When you think that these men built the White House, but they didn't get paid, their owner got paid. Philip Reed didn't get paid, his owner got paid. But we also left aesthetic design. So some of this was also the creativity of some of these buildings wasn't dictated to them. They actually came up with it themselves. And then I want to talk about newspapers and racial capitalism, because a lot of people, you know, you often hear people, well, my family never owned slaves, so therefore I have no accountability. But your folks may have owned newspapers. They may have been lawyers. Because one of the things that I've seen in newspapers from all the 2 places I've really looked is in Havana, Cuba, and in Charleston, is that ads dominated the early newspapers. There were more ads related to enslaved persons than anything else, any other kinds of ads. And if you look at these slides, the first one in the left is from Brazil, a runaway Creole from a Rio neighborhood has run away. And there is an amount there of 50 reales if they bring him back. The one below it is from South Carolina. That one is not a runaway ad. That is an ad for sales. And if you look at the bottom of that ad, it says Austin, Lawrence, and Appleby. That was the law firm. They were the agents of the people who were selling. And so they were responsible for making the sale. So they are getting their 30% or whatever it is, like they get in real estate. So lawyers were making money. And the one on the far right top, that's a runaway from the US as well. And then the one below that is from Haiti. One of the things I'll say about these ads before I say something about the middle one is that they are a very interesting source for research and understanding who people were, because this is before photography. So they put a lot of information in there about the people who'd run away. That runaway in the top right corner, she speaks fluent French and English. Think about that. And then the one at the bottom, under the Brazilian one, it basically says, and this is also important, that these are Negroes, just 250 fine, healthy Negroes just arrived from the Windward and Rice coast. That is the Senegambia area of West Africa. They put that there because they wanted, when one of the things we've learned with the ads, when they sold people, they sold them with knowledge of where they came from and knowledge of their skill set. So people from Senegambia could produce rice and knew how to produce rice. So they were sold in South Carolina in huge numbers because they actually brought skills of rice cultivation there. Same thing, Benin, you know, all that wonderful ironwork in New Orleans and in South Carolina and Charleston, Africans did that. And they knew how to do it before they came as enslaved persons. Then the ad in the middle is so interesting because if anyone reads Spanish, this is El Faro, a newspaper from Havana. What's interesting about Havana, they didn't just have sale and runaway ads. They also had ads that to rent, to lease, and to trade, you know, to sort of to lease and also to rent. So to lease and to rent. So they had renting and leasing ads. So this is an ad to lease, and it says that there is a young Black woman who has milk for 40 days and she's very clean and robust, and she has a lot of abundant leche. So these were called crianderas, and they were people these were nursemaids. So one of the things would happen is a young enslaved woman in Havana would have a baby, and they would sell her out, or not sell her, rent her out to provide milk for white babies. So someone would come and pay the owner to lease her out so that she could give milk to their babies. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? So it's very interesting. So when we think about ads like that, and you think about early newspapers, and you know, early newspapers were more ads than anything else. In South Carolina, I found out that the South Carolina Gazette, which was founded in 1732, in that year, they produced one edition a week that was 4 pages long. So that's 52 editions. I counted all the ads in that whole year in those 52 editions related to enslavement, and there were 268 ads related to enslavement. 268 ads in a 4-page flyer in 52 editions. The majority of the ads were in fact related to enslavement. And we're talking about ads, so the newspaper owners are making money. And the lawyers are making money. So I'm going to stop there and we'll take a few more questions.
Let's get into some questions.
Or comments.
Let's look at one of the newer questions. When we talk about reparations, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, et cetera, are these the corporations that we should be targeting when it comes to reparation?
They're definitely the lowest hanging fruit, yes, because we have records of what they did. We know what they did. You know, taking a newspaper to task in this period will be a little harder. But yes, I do agree that we should be challenging those companies. to make reparation. One of the things too about J.P. Morgan that a lot of people may not know, and of course that's the founder of Chase Bank today, it was Chase Bank today, is that he went into business with a South African in 1917 to found the gold mine, one of the largest, the Anglo-American gold mines in South Africa, which was the largest conglomerate of gold mines in South Africa. So he made money
I mean,
here
I think they're saying which
off
one.
of enslavement, and he made money in South Africa off of white supremacy and apartheid.
All right, our next question says, what about Christian institutions that were involved in slavery? Like the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary comes to mind, and Jim Johnson was ago.
Yeah, I heard a recent Southern Baptist leader, I think he's probably still for slavery, the way he talked. Yeah, I mean, those organizations were a part of it. Everybody was a part of it. I hate to say that. It was like I say, like we drive cars, we ride on planes. That's all connected to oil and fossil fuels. And so almost everybody in one way or another was involved in the economy. I found a very interesting person that his name was Jabu Jones, and he was from Charleston. And believe it or not, he was a free Black that ran the most prominent hotel in Charleston. And all of the white rich folk from all over the South, when they came, they stayed at his hotel. I'm trying to find more information on him because I don't know how he did it, you know? But he did it, and these were slave owners. So even Jabu Jones wanted to make a living, and he's making a living not directly involved in enslavement, but actually servicing those who did. So, and then sometimes we've heard about Black people buying other Black people. It happened. Of course, it didn't happen to a large extent, but it did happen because it was the economy of the day. But also, often those sales were sales of relatives. So the only way a man might get his wife from a plantation is to buy her, you know, or the only way he could have some support in his house on a small farm was to engage in buying. So I would say that yes, the Christian entities need to be, especially those friars that were involved in Georgetown and Catholic institutions, because they were definitely investing and involved in the enslavement of people. So yeah.
Going back to the previous section on the Middle Age of Africa, is there any information, this is from Christina Young, is there any information or resources regarding the contribution of ancient African medical practices to the development of Western medicine during that era?
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Oh, wow. I don't know about that era of medicine, but I do know about later eras. And we do know that the majority of midwives during enslavement all over the Americas were African women who brought their skills of midwifery from Africa. And they were so good and so well known that even the women, white women, wanted to go to them. They were known. So the white mistress of a plantation, when she had her baby, she wanted that particular midwife to be there, to be the one to deliver. What's so interesting is there is literature, and actually, what's her name? Medical Apartheid, Harriet Washington's book, Medical Apartheid, talks about the rise of the modern medical industry in the United States, and how when white men rose in the mid 1800s to try to capture that they to take over that market of taking care of people and delivering babies, they had to literally propagandize against African women in order to get white women to come to them. So she talks about that. And I think that it makes perfect sense. And that's the other thing I think that's so important about this story is that Africans brought skills. They didn't come over here as unskilled people. And Europeans knew it and saw it, and they lied about it. They lied about not saying these folks were nothing. But they used them when use their skills when they could. And then, of course, we do know that the father of gynecological science, whose name I didn't write down right now, but it'll come to me. If someone knows that, put it in the chat. It's not, I don't have it in front of me, but that he actually used, he bought women, Black women, and did gynecological experiments on them to solve certain gynecological problems, such as fistulas, which is when women would bleed out having a baby. So he did that on Black women without anesthesia. So those are some of the things I do know about the skills that Africans brought with them and what was done with them.
Thank you, Dr. Brock. We have another question from Christina Young related to the ads. And she says, when you mentioned the leasing of nursemaids, what were the babies born to the enslaved women fed once the mother had been taken?
Well, often this would be day labor. So the woman wouldn't be, it's interesting. See, this is not a sale, this is a lease. So often the woman would go and feed their babies and come back and feed her baby at the same time. That's one way. Another way that happened also all over the Americas is that there were women who, can you imagine? I can't imagine this. There were women whose job it was to continue lactating to feed a lot of enslaved babies while their mothers worked. And so you would have one woman whose job it was to feed the Black babies. And she may, I don't, if you know the science of it, you can lactate for years if you keep at it. You only stop lactating once the baby stops connecting on the breast. So so you would have women who were nursemaids, and that was their plantation job. So that was another thing that happened.
Thank you, Dr. Brock. We are going to keep moving through your presentation.
Okay. Oh, I should say about these ads too. There's there's some work being done to try to actually transcribe all these ads, because some of them are very old. You can't read them very well. I would suggest any of you all, even while we're sitting here, if you want, is to go Google, just Google runaway slave ads and see how many come up. It is estimated that there are 250,000 known runaway slave ads just from the US. And so anybody that tells you folks were happy being enslaved, I think that's evidence to the contrary. Enslavement and resistance. This is our fourth area. No, third area. Fourth area, I can't remember. Anyway, we're going to enslavement and resistance is very, very important. And what I want to do with this slide is just to show you how much resistance there was everywhere, all across the Americas. The book here, The Common Wind by Julius Scott, is a wonderful book. Basically, he looks at the Haitian Revolution. And I hope everybody in our audience knows about the Haitian Revolution. If you don't, look it up. There's a lot of books on it. Carolyn Finch, there's just a lot of work. Black Jacobins, there's a lot of books on the Haitian Revolution, which was the second American revolution. The US happened first and then Haiti. But of course, Haiti was different because Haiti was democratic. It said everybody could vote, not just white men. So Haiti had their revolution, and women fought in the revolution, And I've often seen the Haitian Revolution as what I call the Pan-African movement. I mean, the Pan-African moment, because once Haiti happened, enslaved people all over the Americas. Can you imagine? Most people wanted to go home, you know, they just wanted to go home. And if you were born into enslavement, your parents would say, you know, home was so much better. So people wanted to go back to Africa. But as time moved on, it became increasingly clear that that was unlikely to happen. And so, although there were movements where people did go back, some people, but that's another topic. But after the Haitian Revolution, people of African descent throughout the Americas realized that they're unlikely to go home. And if Haiti could do it, so could they. And so the fight for freedom and liberation intensified after the Haitian Revolution, because the Haitian Revolution was a successful Black-led revolution against Napoleon, if you can imagine. And you can imagine George Washington and Thomas Jefferson at this time shaking in their boots, because the Haitians used the same language that was used in the American Revolution and in the French Revolution to talk about the enslaved being free as well. So those two slides on the right are from Haiti. So the Common Wind talks about Julia Scott talks about the influence of the Haitian Revolution throughout the Americas. I mean, it's a fascinating book. He talks about, you know, maroon runaway societies coming in and talking to people on a plantation in Jamaica. And then the plantation folks go into town and they talk to the women and the men who are traders and working in town. Information is spread like wildfire about the Haitian Revolution. There's this one famous saying that Thomas Jefferson said, that his slaves knew about the Haitian Revolution before he did. And that's because of the ship trade too, because African enslaved persons were actually used as sailors on a lot of the trading ships that were not slave trading ships. So all the other goods that were being traded at the time often had 25 to 50% Africans owned by the captains working on those ships, and they would pass that information on. They would dock in Caracas, in Havana, in Kingston, Charleston, New York. And as they would get off the boat, they would share the information. So the top slide, Jose Aponte in Cuba attempted to lead a revolt based on the Haitian Revolution in 1812. It was discovered, people talked, and he and his comrades were hung. One of the interesting things about Aponte is that he had a book, that illustrated book of the Haitian that he did himself based on his own learning. He could read, and about Ethiopia and the history of Ethiopia as a site of early independent kingdom. And he took that around to recruit people to join him, to build up Black consciousness, to build up self-esteem, to say there have been places in the world where Blacks have been free on their own terms. And then 1822 is Denmark Vesey. There's a statue of him that's hidden in Charleston. It was a big fight to get it up. And then when they put it up, it's in Hampton Park. There's still discussion about moving it more downtown, but there is a sculpture there of him. And he did a similar thing to Aponte, using Haiti as a reference for 1822. And it's likely that he was from Haiti too, initially. That's what people believe, that he was a migrant from Haiti. And then Jamaica, 1831. So you had the burning of the Roehampton estate during what was called the Baptist War on Christmas Day, 1831. So there was always resistance of every type, and people did attempt to revolt. Yes, so I wanted to make sure you understood that during the period of enslavement, there was resistance. And of course, there was every day different kinds of resistance. I mean, people, enslaved people slowly poisoned their masters, put cut glass in the soup. They did a lot of different things to resist. And so I wanted to show you that. And I'm going to keep moving. This one is the U.S. Imperial Project. I decided to add this slide to this because we need to, we in the U.S. often think of Blackness just as ourselves, right? And we often see what the U.S. does abroad, not necessarily in racial terms. But in reality, it goes all the way back to the manifest destiny of the 1830s and 40s when the U.S. took Texas and or stirred up a conflict in Texas in order to start the Mexican-American War in 1848, so they could take the rest of the United States from the central part of the US, like Ohio and Tennessee, and move it all the way to California. So that was the first. And I put two quotes here I thought that were so interesting because we don't often think about these early leaders of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson thinking about colonial expansion, which of course at that time it was. They are the US is the colonizer, and they are colonizing the continent. And Benjamin Franklin argued that the British were imposing restrictions on colonial expansion. He's quoted as saying, "A prince would be remembered as the nation's lord who acquires a new territory and eliminates the natives to give his people space." And of course, that did happen. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We will drive them, the savages. We will drive them into the stony mountains with the beasts of the trees, and eventually the nation will be clean of blot or mixture, that is red or black." So the idea was to move west and open up lands for white people, and they did. I mean, the Homestead Act after the Civil War gave any head of household free 165 acres. And you can go and also find some of those deeds. Very few Black people, of course, got that. And so when you think about people say, just pull yourself up with your bootstraps. Well, the government gave them boots, gave certain folks boots. Of course, not everybody, but a lot of white settlers were encouraged to come and to do that. Then the US also gets involved in Latin America. In fact, there was this huge argument that Latin America, Central America and the Caribbean and Latin America were the United States backyard. So they were the big power. They had a right to that territory for whatever they wanted it for. And this is so interesting because you may have heard about the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885 in Berlin, when European powers literally carved up Africa and came to an agreement of who could take what. So Britain, Germany, France were the three big ones, and then Portugal and Spain were kind of the smaller ones by that time, 1884, 1885, because they were not the big, they had been involved in slave trade, but they did not industrialize. They didn't have major industrial revolutions like the northern countries had. And so the US actually was there, but they were there as an observer. And a part of the Berlin Conference was an agreement that Europe would take Africa and the US would be involved in Latin America. So what's so interesting, and what I have here, if I can, I lost my mouse again, y'all. I'd lost my mouse earlier. I was going to give you a list of US interventions. I mean, there's hundreds of the US intervening in Haiti and occupying Haiti, in Honduras, in Guatemala. They organized the coup in Chile in the 70s, the death squads in El Salvador. CIA organized the killing of Berta Serra in the Honduras, and that was during the Obama administration, mind you. And the US continues to punish Cuba for its desire to be socialist. And one of the things I wanted to mention about the U.S. intervention is that we've often heard, it's a contradiction too. We've often heard of the so-called Spanish-American War. Well, for Cuba, it was the Cuban-Spanish War, right? And the U.S. intervenes in 1898 when the Cubans were winning. When the Cubans were winning, and claim it's there to support the Cubans, when in fact it's there to take over from Spain. It militarily occupies the island and helps write into the Constitution a thing called the Platt Amendment, which literally gave the U.S. the right to intervene should any destabilization happen. It also gave them the right to this little thing, a military base called Guantanamo. Now, what's so interesting about Guantanamo, and which is something that's so dastardly, is that Guantanamo is a Black area. It's a Black area. They decided to put the military base there because they wanted to watch the Black people. And they had a 99-year lease when for $100 a year that they paid the Cubans, $100 a year. So when, and the Platt Amendment also gave them unfettered access to the Cuban market. So when the revolution happens in 1959, Fidel Castro kept getting the check for $100 and he would just put them in a drawer. There's a famous video clip of him showing all the checks that he put in the drawer because he refused to cash them because it's an insult. And he didn't want Guantanamo there. And then, of course, Guantanamo becomes a site of torture as they begin to, and it's so interesting, they put them in Cuba because that's technically a US territory, but it's not in the US. So you can engage in torture. That's one of the reasons they're off-site in Guantanamo. There's been movements. We thought Obama would get rid of Guantanamo, but Guantanamo is still there, although I think more and more people are being sent home. If you look at the period between 1898 and 1902, and these are the kind of cartoons you would see. So it's clear that Uncle Sam has a race problem. And what's so interesting, these 4 areas of the world, I don't know if you can see it, these were the ones resisting the US imposition and war between 1898 and 1902. You have the Philippines, you have Hawaii, you have Puerto Rico, and you have Cuba. And basically he's telling them that they need to act right so that they can join the people behind them. And the people behind them are earlier colonized people. You have California, you have Texas, you have Alaska. And then it's so insulting because you have an indigenous Indian over there reading a book upside down. And then you have a person that appears to be of Chinese caricature standing at the door. And these cartoons were all over the US during the so-called Spanish-American War. I'm going to end with this slide. I had some videos to show you, but I can't figure, maybe someone else can they can help me. We can figure out how to show it, but I don't think we're going to be able to because my mouse keeps going out between these 2 screens. But I wanted to end with this, what is Blackness? I said at the beginning that Blackness is really making a political point. There was no white nor Black before the enslavement of Africans. And so, people from Catalan, people from Wales, people from England, people from Scotland, people from France, people from Germany came to the United States. And over time, during the process of genocide against Native Americans and enslavement of Africans, they became white. And they made a decision that they should be supreme and their history should be supreme. And people of African descent became Black. It was a process that happened over time. And so Blackness is a social construction, but it developed, and this is important, it developed all over the Americas, but it developed in highly complex context. One of the things I think is so interesting about Cuba, which I've done research on, is the fact that Cuba had, the demography was that Cuba always had slightly more Blacks than whites. Like a lot of these Latin American countries. Remember I told you more came to Latin America? And so all of these places engaged in whitening projects. They tried to bring they had all these whitening projects to bring white people over to try to not have Black majorities. But the interesting thing about Cuba, it ended up about half and half, maybe 60% what we would consider Black and 40% white. And what they did in Cuba is there was, like all these places, there's a lot of race mixture. And so they create other categories in order to create a buffer between white and Black, a kind of category that can be used both to filter white supremacy. So you end up with Black people being taught that they should try to be mulatto, and you have mulatto people being taught that they should marry and try to be white. And they did have a law in Spanish Cuba that basically said in 3 generations, that offspring could declare themselves white. And it didn't matter necessarily what they look like. Unlike the 1-drop rule here, in Cuba, that was not the case. So what you ended up with, which I find very interesting, is that in the US, if you had 1 drop of African blood, you were considered Black. In Cuba, if you only had 1 drop of African blood, you were considered white. You get, it's different. So very different context. And yet, Black struggles happened in all places and continue to happen in all places. And I put 4 people up here because I wanted you just to know that these are folks who worked in these areas. W.B. Du Bois from the US worked on Pan-Africanism and internationalism. He had Pan-African conferences in the early days. One of the challenges, when you look at the pictures, you think only men were there. There were women there too, but they weren't put in the pictures, Black women. So Mrs. Hudson was one, and some others. So that's important to remember. And, Frantz Fanon talked about colonialism and that what it did to African people in terms of internalized colonialism. His great book, Black Skin, White Mask, talks about it. He says people become independent and they can't wait to get their French water and their Mercedes. So Fanon was from Martinique originally, but wrote a lot about the colonial condition in Africa. And then I have a picture here at the bottom on the left, the Australian Black Panthers from 1972. A lot of people don't realize that the Aborigines of Australia were very moved by the Black Power movement in the United States and actually formed a Black Panther Party. And there's not a lot on it. There's some iconography left. But I think what I'm going to do after this too is I'll try to put together a reading list that goes with my slides. So that people can have it as a reference and we can put it on the website. And then these 2 sisters at the bottom, there was a lot of Black feminist solidarity historically and in more recent periods. Marielle Franco was an activist from a favela in Rio. She was assassinated by the Bolsonaro regime because she was so effective at organizing people, women, LGBTQ folks, and Black folks. And then Francia Marquez, who I actually met about 15 years ago, has been organizing since she was 13, 14 years old. She's in her 40s now, I think 41, and she just became the vice president of Colombia. I know that people from the movement for Black Lives went down to work on her, to be election observers for her campaign. And I also know that different folks from the US actually also went to Brazil in this most recent election. So I'm going to stop there and we'll take any more.
Dr.
Yeah.
Brock, I actually have the video queued up on my YouTube if you still want to share it. I can share it on your behalf.
Yes. And And go to this, that's great, thank you. And go to the Sammy Sosa piece. Or can I, if you pull it up, can I stop it or you can stop it? I won't be able to.
I
stop
can stop. I mean, I can start it from the beginning. I can start it.
Okay, and I can tell you when to stop.
All right. Mhm. I'll just share it now. Okay. You see it? Okay.
We can see it, can't hear it though. We can't hear it, Nicholas.
Oh, how to make it.
I am, but I'm gonna turn on the sound first. Can you hear it now, Dr. Brock?
It's still very low. I don't know about other people, but it's very low. I don't know why.
Towns in the Americas, San Basilio de Palenque, Colombia. Listen to the drums, explore the murals, and study the dancing. It was founded around 1603 by self-liberated Africans who escaped from the slave ports of Cartagena, Colombia. Spanish colonizers relentlessly tried to destroy this town, but centuries later, it's still standing. And this is the only Black president Colombia has had. They purposely erased him from history books. Government officials even sent his official presidential portrait to Paris to whiten his appearance. You may not have expected to find stories like these in Latin America. See, the dominant narrative is that racism doesn't exist in the region, just class issues. And I'm here to tell you that is a lie.
Pero que no hay negros en la Argentina. Por la forma que...
It's a very convenient cop-out for Latin America and for Latinos, Latinas to say, well, it's not as bad as the US, and they're right, it's worse.
This is a story about Latin America's long and brutal history of erasing and silencing Black populations and its ploy to whiten society. Here's the thing. Anti-Blackness is so deeply ingrained in the Latin American region that it's often ignored or defended, like in the case of Dominican baseball player Sammy Sosa, who downplayed using a bleaching cream that whitened his skin. From Peruvian newspapers using 159 different racist adjectives to describe.
Okay, we're gonna put this whole film in the chat as well. All right, well, thank you. So we're taking some, I've seen nice compliments on the chat. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. You know, the thing with me is so difficult to just talk to a screen and not see people. I love seeing faces. So
Yeah. Sorry.
That's
All
okay.
right, we have one more question that was from at the very first section of your presentation. It says, how were the numbers of captives from the various regions determined, and were ship records kept consistently?
The numbers weren't determined per se. It wasn't that organized. They would go to a port and the capturers would bring people and put them, if you've been to Elmina or the or Goree, you know where people were kept. Then they'd be loaded into a ship. Sometimes a big ship would go and want more people, and sometimes they try to go to 2 or 3 ports. Sometimes the ship was too small and they couldn't take everybody. So I don't think it wasn't, or numbers weren't necessarily organized on the European side, but Africans had incentives to bring as many as possible as they could to the to the ports area to be loaded. So I don't think so. Numbers happened, but keep in mind, I said 192 ports. So it's a lot of, you don't need a whole lot for how many years, a whole bunch of years. You don't need a whole lot for hundreds of years from any one port. But there's a lot of ports that are operating. And the second part was what? What was the second part of the question, Christina?
There we go. The second part of the question said, good question. I lost it. Give me a second. Were the ship records kept consistently?
Sometimes and sometimes no. Sometimes and sometimes no. So you can see a lot of ship manifest in the European archives. So you can see where they took people and if someone wrote down how many they had. And there was a lot of corruption, of course, as well. So people would put fewer numbers than they had so that they could sell them and not have to give it back, paying dividends to the people that had invested in their companies or were invested in their voyages. And so you had a lot of corruption as well, but you do have ship manifest in quite a few places, and you can see where they got people and how many they got on particular ships. In terms of slave wrecks, one of the things that's most interesting, I do know that when the Smithsonian's African American History Museum was being developed, that they actually had women divers in Senegal diving because there were ships right off that coast, and they were diving to see people, skeletal remains on the boats, and also any other things that might have been on those boats that could come back to the museum. I'm not quite sure if anything actually came back. I don't remember seeing that, but I've only been there once. But I do know those voyages were happening because a curator by the name of Debbie Mack was going back and forth to Senegal to work with those women.
Perfect. And we have one more question, and it's kind of a knowledge question from Barbara Williams. It says, do you know anything about Black Greeks in Eastern Greece or near Turkey?
No. No, I don't. I've often wondered why, I've often wondered about the Greek symbology. But I do know there's a lot of symbology on a lot of things in the West from Egypt and from Greece in the ancient worlds. Mm-hmm.
All right, and our last question says, were there Black Indigenous people here in what we now know as America before the Pan-African slave trade?
Interesting question. There is some evidence that at least a ship or two made it here. If the Ivan van Sertima's book, They Came Before Columbus, talks about that. The Olmec statues in Mexico, the way they look, the way the Mayans look, there's some phenotypical similarities there. And so there is some of that. So someone just said, oh, Olmec is indigenous. I'm not saying it's not indigenous. I'm saying whether or not African people were there before that was built, and therefore they become integrated into the society. So that's not my era that I study. So I'm not, I don't know where the state of that data is right now. I do know that there are Black people in Mexico now, and the Yucatan, Black Mexicans, but they date back from the enslavement period. So when I say that they came before Columbus, there's this idea that it's possible that somebody asked me, am I in front of an African cemetery? And yes, I can say a little bit about that. That a ship might have made it, but there wasn't a lot of people coming. You know what I'm saying? So let's say one ship managed to go out and make it. They didn't go back, they stayed. So, I mean, I think that's what Yvonne von Sertima is talking about.
And that was our last question. So if you wanted to talk about your background before Michelle comes on.
So this is a Black cemetery I visited in Wando, South Carolina, which is just outside of Charleston, across one of those rivers. It's kept by the Black community that lives there. And a guy by the name of Fred Lincoln, his family owns acres and acres of land. They bought it at the end of the slave trade, and they've managed to maintain it all this time. He had me laughing because I met him and he took us there, me and my husband. And the land is so vast, and he and his relatives, his grandmother lived there, and so they had a little small school and a small church, and they have a lot of land. And so there are some white people on his land that rent the land for their they had trailers on his property, kind of sitting way out away from the houses. And they had Trump signs up in 2016. So we were laughing about that they must feel really bad about having to pay a Black man to live on his land, and they're living in a trailer and supporting Trump rather than supporting the people that are supporting them, right? But anyway, yeah, so it's a wonderful place to visit. It's a place where they bought the land at the end of the slavery, and they were able to maintain it. It was an old, according to him, it was an old Vanderbilt owned plantation.
Well, once again, it's been a wonderful, wonderful evening. Dr. Brock, you have outdone yourself. And guess what? Someone wants to have your contact information to reach out to you regarding engagement. So you could take a moment and put that in the chat for everybody to see. Sometimes we have it on the concluding slide, but we don't have that today.
What I can say is that they can find me on LinkedIn, because of course I can't use my mouse right now. This mouse is, but I managed to figure out how to move the slides. But so they can find me on LinkedIn, or they can reach out to Asala again and find me.
Very good. Excellent. All right. Well, I know that Howard University has joined us, and as always, we thank them for bringing the opportunity to us to do these programs through the grant. And I see Dr. Bahia Muhammad is on. Dr. Muhammad, would you like to give us a few words from Howard? We thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. I am definitely very excited to be able to come in on the tail end of Dr. Brock's just riveting dialogue and conversation, just looking at the videos and seeing all of the information in the chat. We are so excited at Howard University to be partnering with the phenomenal Asala for these Wednesday workshops that have been such a treat. Many of the students are still talking about what they've learned from last semester, as well as the social justice kits. So we are very excited to be here. I send salutations from the PI of this phenomenal Mellon grant, Dr. Nikki Teller, who serves as the chair of the history department at Howard University, and is very excited about this partnership and our movement to move forward. It is very important when we think about the Social Justice Consortium and certificate to really equip individuals with the knowledge, the information, the skills, and also the passion to be able to move forward, to be able to solve solutions in their own communities. What we heard this evening is information that can be used immediately, information that will allow us to think about the ways that we engage with the global world as well as with our own communities. On behalf of Howard University, I just thank you so much for stepping up and taking this initiative to be able to educate us all. We have heard phenomenal remarks and feedback on the conference. And so to have this coming right on the heels of that information and critical consciousness building during that week is definitely a blessing to us all. So again, thank you all so much. And I look forward to attending the next session that will be held on Wednesday.
Thank you. Dr. Delaney.
I just want to thank Dr. Brock for that excellent presentation, and I'm looking forward to next week.
So thank you all for joining us again for this social justice community event. We're really trying to reach out to the community at large and help educate, inspire. But next week is going to be a really good session because, as Dr. Muhammad mentioned, we have a toolkit, and the toolkit is developed from all the workshops we've done. And so next week, Dr. Brock will be doing the how to use your toolkit. So we'll walk you through the toolkit. We'll show you how to take this information and become a social justice leader in your community as well. Thank you all again for joining. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next week. And don't forget to join Asala. Bye-bye.